All right, hello folks, this is Mr. Majewski, and we're going to be covering language today. We're going to start out with a language unit by going through the Chapter 5, Key Issue 1, Language PowerPoint. We're going to be going pretty quickly here, and the reason for that is, of course, that you can start and stop as you need to. So if Mr. Majewski goes quickly through some parts and you need to stop it or slow it down, please feel free to do so and just pick it up right where you left off. Language is an important unit in this culture unit, and it is something that we need to focus on, although we can't spend as much time as we'd like. It's an interesting topic. It's an interesting chapter, and this is again going to correspond to Chapter 5, Key Issue 1, and the learning guide that you're doing over the Thanksgiving break. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, and here I am with Mr. Guinness as my sidekick, and we are going to get started right away. So, language is a system of communication through speech or a collection of sounds that a group of people understands to have the same meaning. Pretty straightforward definition there. We normally associate it with speech. But in theory, it could be just a collection of sounds as well, including some of the African languages that, for instance, just use sounds instead of actual words or speech in order to communicate. You know, things like, all right, that sort of stuff. Let's move it on. Of course, there are many, many different languages around the world. And, of course, this gives you a good idea of the variety, right? This is the word welcome. Around the world in various languages. As you can see, just one word, for instance, with one meaning has tons of different ways to say it depending on the language that you are practicing. Now, it's a great statistical site called Ethnologue. It does limit the amount of time you can spend on it and the number of pages you can view, but it's a great site to check out. They identify 7,106 living languages in the world. Of course, a living language is a language that, well, people speak. And I love this kind of bubble map that they provide to us because it kind of shows you, based on the size of the circles here, which languages are the most commonly spoken. Of course, as you can tell on this list, Mandarin is the most commonly spoken. That, of course, is the primary language of China. Not a shocker there. English is the second most spoken language. Hindi, right, the primary language of India. And then Espanol, Spanish, would be fourth. All right. I think people are oftentimes surprised to see that, maybe not so much Arabic, but that Portuguese is up there as well. Remember, Portuguese is not only the language of Portugal, it's also the language of Brazil. Anyways, over 7,000 living languages around the world. Of those 7,000, only 11 are spoken by over 100 million people, and we get into most of those languages. 85 are spoken by at least 10 million. 300 are spoken by, essentially at least a million people. That means the remaining 6,700 languages are spoken by less than 1 million people. In fact, many of them spoken by far fewer than that number. We have a number of languages that are extinct or dying out or endangered. We'll cover those in class through an activity with the Chromebooks, where you can see that in many cases a language might just have as few as 1 or 2 speakers remaining, which means that obviously that language is on the verge of extinction. Hand in hand with a language is its literary tradition. That's a written system of communication. So obviously languages are spoken. However, if there is a literary tradition, and there's not always, all right, then there is a written system of communication as well. In the English language, that's the alphabet. That's not the case always with other languages, for instance, and some. They use images to depict what's happening with words rather than the traditional alphabet that we are familiar with. And again, we'll work on that in class a little bit so you can see it in action. All right. There we go. Written systems of the world, right? As you can see, we use what's known as the Latin alphabet, along with much of North America, South America, and Europe, which means we have a traditional alphabet system. There are some others as well. The Cyrillic alphabet is used in Russia, for instance, in Eastern Europe. The Arabic, I guess we'll call it alphabet, is used throughout North Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia. East Asia, like for instance the Chinese and the Japanese, they actually use images to communicate. So we will practice this again, but it's not a traditional alphabet like we would think. A picture represents actually a word, and then that can mean, slight changes to the drawing can mean instead of, for instance, the sun, it can mean the sun coming up. All right. Many countries designate at least one official language to be used for official documents and public objects like road signs and money. The United States does not have an official language. That's why you'll notice that oftentimes our documents are provided in multiple languages. But that's unusual. Most countries do have an official language. Now, there's a reason for that. That usually makes it easier to communicate, to conduct business, to conduct government activity. And so an official language is quite common. So that you need to be familiar with that term, be able to distinguish it and what it means. All right, here we go. Road signs in Israel, in Jerusalem, right? Hebrew is kind of the common language that's spoken there. It is the official language, but you'll notice as well they do produce things in English as well for folks in case they do not speak the official language there. For instance, visitors. International languages with official national status. All right. So as you can see here, right, United States on there. I don't know if we would consider ourselves to have an official language, but English is the most common de facto or kind of de jure language that is spoken. As you can see, it's English throughout North America, Spanish throughout Central and South America, with the exception of Brazil, right? Which, of course, speaks Portuguese, as you can see. Africa is a real mix, right, of official languages, but though I do want you to note, almost all of them are actually European, right? You see that? Arabic or European, so they're outside languages that have been made official. That has to do with the era of colonization. No real shockers here, I think. You can see that Europe, obviously, is a mixture of official languages. And as you can see, there's a number of countries there that are not depicted on this map. This really just shows the largest official languages that are out there. Okay? Okay. With 447 spoken languages, India has struggled to designate an official language, and this kind of explains to us some of the problems with official languages, is that they hardly reflect what's being spoken inside the country. India is a great example of that. It's an extreme example of that, but as you can see, 447 languages being spoken there. That demonstrates to you that while the government can say there's one official language, that doesn't necessarily mean the people are speaking it. And I think we're probably a good example of that as well. While English is the primary language here in the United States, we have many folks, including folks in this room, that probably speak other languages as their primary language at home. The 6 official languages of the United Nations, these are the 6 dominant. We call them kind of the, I guess you could call them the universal languages. English, of course, Arabic, Chinese or Mandarin, Spanish, Russian, and French. These are the languages that are actually spoken at the UN. What I mean by that is anytime somebody speaks, there's always translators. These people wear like listening devices, almost like headphones. And when speeches are given, everybody at the UN is expected to know one of these languages, and that is the language that it will be translated into. So everybody understands what's happening. For instance, when the United Nations meets and the General Assembly has speeches, you'll see a lot of folks there with headphones or listening devices on so that they can follow along in one of the 6 standard languages that are kind of officially designated by the UN. Now, let's get into this, because this is the heart of language and the language unit in geography. How are languages organized? Okay. So working kind of from the largest groups to the smallest groups. We start with language families. Language families are a collection of languages that are related through a common ancestral language. So language families include a lot of languages that trace their origin back to a common ancestor. What we mean there is one language that started, eventually it broke up, but it all originally started as one big language. And then as time went by, that language broke up into smaller, different, unique ones. But all of those languages can trace their origin back to that one family. And so they're all a part of that one family. It would almost be like, if you traced your ancestry back to like your great-great-grandfather, and you are connected with everybody that's a descendant of your great-great-grandfather. You're all part of the same kind of large family, even though you're all very different, right? Even though you've all branched out, even though you've all married other people and things like that, and had children and grandchildren and so, you can all trace your origin back to that one language family, that one starter. So language families are large, and they're all related in some way through a common ancestral language. After a language family, all right, we break those language families up into smaller groups, and those are known as language branches. That's a collection of languages within a family that have more close connection. They're very similar to one another. They're more similar to one another than the family was. And because they have more similarities, we break them up within the family itself based on maybe common origin, kind of common word usage, common use of verbiage, all right, maybe a similar alphabet. And so, while the language family is all related, it's really just related in a very general sense, whereas a branch, the languages within a branch are much more similar to one another. They're usually geographically close to one another as well. Finally, the last organization we have for language is groups. Groups are even smaller than branches, so they're going to include an even smaller number of languages. And they're a collection of languages within a branch. They display very similar grammar and vocabulary. So again, working from most recent to oldest, you start with language groups. Those usually include a handful of languages, and they are all connected together very closely, very similar to one another, like Spanish and Italian. All right. And then you trace it back to a language branch, which is a collection of larger number of languages that all have similar kind of common ties, though not as specific as the group did. And then ultimately, a group of language branches are connected together and lumped together into one language family based on kind of their connection to some ancestral language that they all share kind of a basis or an origin from. This is a very important slide that you really need to focus on. This is a great way of looking at language families, language branches, and language groups. So for instance, they usually use a tree for this, all right? And you'll notice down at the bottom there, kind of in the trunk or the root system there, that would be the language family. So what they're saying is, hey, every one of those languages that you see here with the big giant Indo-European tree is all part of the same language family. They all trace their root back to one common origin, the Indo-European language, all right? And then what you see there is, as time goes by, and as we become more diverse, and as maybe languages spread out, they branch out, they become unique, they become different from one another. They're no longer as closely connected, and they develop their own dialects, their own ways of speaking, and they break out into their own branches. So the trunks of the trees represent the different language branches, right, that you can see there. You've got Indo-Iranian, you got European, which breaks up into, Germanic and Romance, right? Slavic, all right? Albanian, Celtic, right? And then you notice the Indo-Iranian branch, right? Branches out into Indic and Iranian. And then as you can see, the little leaves, or the, I don't know what you want to call that, foliage there, represents individual languages. So again, you've got the language family, right? Which are all related to a common ancestor, Indo-European, right? Then you've got the branches that break out there, right? Like Romance and Germanic and Slavic. And then, Indo-Iranian, you've got Indic, right? You've got Iranian, you've got the Indic languages. And then as you get further up the tree, you get into groups, right? And then eventually you see the individual languages that have formed again, that are like kind of the foliage on the tree, all right? And you'll notice the size of the foliage, the size of the leaves, I guess you'll call it, there indicates how many people actually speak that language. So you'll notice, for instance, English and Spanish are the larger ones, right? Hindi, Russian, Bengali. The point of that being, folks, is every one of those languages there is part of the same family. That's the largest family in the world, Indo-European. You see how they all trace, if you work backwards from the foliage back down to the root system, they all trace their origin back to that one ancestral language. I don't know if you would think, oh my goodness, people speaking Hindi speak the same root language as Russian and English and Spanish. Yes, they all tie their origin back to that original language. And then there's a smaller trunk there, as you can see as well. You see the Uralic on the bottom right? And that just kind of shows you, hey, that would be a different language family, the Uralic languages that are not connected. So Hungarian and Finnish, for instance, we note are connected are to one another, but they are not connected to the rest of Europe or the rest of the European languages. This is probably a more traditional way of looking at it. This is the kind of tree that is oftentimes used. As you can see, we've got our root system kind of identifies the origin, and then as you can see, they branch out from language families at the bottom. They branch up to language branches, right? Like, Slavic, Balto-Slavic, that sort of thing. And eventually they break up into individual smaller language groups. I think a good example of that would be kind of maybe German, all right? As you can see here, we start with Proto-Indo-European, which is the root language that they all started from, right? Then we get into the Balto-Slavic and Germanic family, right? You'll see the Germans kind of split up into a Northern and a Western German language branch. And then we have individual languages or groups here, right, where we can see English and German being spoken on one side, and Danish, Norwegian, Swedish on the other. Again, we're going to spend a lot of time on this because this is a key component of the language unit. Linguists, people that focus on language, believe that all modern languages emerged from only a few ancient superfamilies. It's hard to prove because these root languages no longer exist. They existed a long time ago, maybe thousands or tens of thousands of years ago, or long before we recorded history. But based on common language, common usage of words, we believe we can trace these languages back to our origin language in the area that they all branched out from. All right. Again, these are really, really good examples here, right, where you can see how languages are recorded. You've got the individual languages up here, right, and you'll see that they're connected here by a language group, right. They're all part of the language branch. Alrighty, and then they go back and tie their roots, right, to a language family. Okay, again, look at all these languages spoken here, right? And as you can see, languages that are connected into groups, group, right? And then they tie they're connected by branch, right? The West Germanic, right? There's also an East Germanic or a North Germanic right there. There's the Romance group or branch, right? Balto-Slavic, Indo-Iranian, all of that them are branches of the same family, the Indo-European family. So here, like Japanese, that's its own branch, that's its own unique language, and that makes sense. Remember, Japan is isolated, they weren't really connected to other countries politically or geographically, and so they developed their own unique language system that really isn't tied or connected to anybody else. All right? So again, this is a wonderful map, and it's in your textbook as well, that kind of shows you which languages of the world are connected to each other and which are absolutely unique and not connected to any other. All right? Now, 2/3 of the world's population speaks a language that belongs to either the Indo-European family or the Sino-Tibetan family. Indo-European obviously includes places like India, all the way over to Europe. That's all one language family. But almost half the world's population speak it, right? 46%. Sino-Tibetan. Sino usually means China. So the kind of the Chinese and Tibetan families. Tibet is a region of China, by the way. About 21% of that population speaks it. All right, or of the world's population. So right there, right, we got about 67% of the world's population speaks one of those two languages, which is pretty fascinating when you stop to think about it. We got about 6% speaking Niger-Congo. Niger-Congo is obviously language that's spoken in Africa. Afro-Asiatic is kind of a funny term because Afro-Asiatic is actually spoken primarily in Asia, even though you see the Afro part and you think that perhaps African would speak it more often. That's not the case. Austronesian is really the languages, I guess you could say, of Southeast Asia, the islands of Southeast Asia, for instance, Indonesia. Dravidian is a language that's spoken in India. It's a minority language there. Altaic is the languages that are spoken in Central Asia. For instance, the Stan countries. Japanese, there you go. Austroasiatic as well is a language that is spoken primarily in Southeast Asia as well. And then, of course, we have others that are not listed there. Okay? Anyways, let's go to Indo-European. It's the dominant language family in Europe, South Asia, North America, and Latin America. Just look at that map. That's crazy, right? Look at how much of the languages around the world originate from Indo-European languages, right? That's craziness if you really stop to think about it. That is a lot of people. Almost half the world's population speak an Indo-European language. That is the dominant language around the world, or language family around the world. And again, look at how wide the variety is. We've got the Germanic languages like English, right, and German. We've got the Romance languages like Italian, Portuguese, Spanish. We've got English speakers here and here because these used to be part, obviously, of the English Empire. We've got Indo-European, we've got Hindi, right, and many of the languages of the Middle East that are considered part of this group as well. And again, that means they all originated from one language, right where this arrow is kind of located. I believe that's probably where they originated and then spread out in different directions and branched out and turned into their own unique languages. The second largest family is Sino-Tibetan. Another great map here that shows you where it's located. It includes the republic, the languages spoken in the People's Republic of China, right? So Mandarin, and then the secondary language in China is called Cantonese. And then several smaller countries in Southeast Asia as well speak Sino-Tibetan. Again, it's not over nearly as much of a geographic area as is Indo-European, but it has about 21% of all of the world's speakers located there. So again, it is kind of got a lot of speakers, right? And that makes sense. China's #1 language. It's the largest country in the world. The most common Sino-Tibetan language is Mandarin. Mandarin is widely used. It's the official language of China. More than 900 million people speak it, about 3/4 of the population. The other quarter speak a language known as Cantonese, which is kind of located in one region of the country, the southeastern portion. The rest of the country speaks Mandarin. All right? Holy moly guacamole. I don't know what happened here with my my slide. There we go. Many systems use something called logograms. It's a symbol that helps to categorize its meaning. Chinese is written in using logograms. They use symbols to convey words. They're not phonetic. A Chinese writer must memorize thousands of different images or logograms in order to write their language down. So you can kind of see what we mean here when we talk about logograms. It's not like a traditional alphabet. Every image represents a word in the language. So for instance, that is the image right there for river. All right. Then this would be river, and you add the second image, and now it means not river, but riverbed, right? So that means river, that means bed. All right. How about lake? Well, you'll notice that the image for river up here, right? You add a few more things to it, right? And now you've moved, and now you're describing a lake instead of a river. So you would have to memorize these images and the differences between them in order, for instance, to understand the difference between a river and a lake in their alphabet system, in their logogram. How about a stream, right? River versus a stream. All right, we see how they're similar, right? But they're different enough where you would need to recognize those, the differences between them in order to know what that word means, to know they were talking about a stream and not a river when they were writing down their language. Finally, how about riptide, right? A riptide, of course, is a thing in the ocean, right? That kind of pulls you out or drags you away from the shoreline, right? And again, similarities with river, right? For instance, over here, right? But as you can see, the remainder of that image is different enough. All right, so thousands of different logograms are used in order to, well, convey the differences in their language. All right, so again, logogram is the other primary literary tradition. We either have alphabets or we have logograms. We either have symbols that represent sounds, phonetic noises, like A, B, C, right? Or we have these logograms, which are images that reflect different words in the alphabet that have nothing to do with the phonetics. They have nothing to do with the word sound itself. China's a really good example. All right, there are a few languages that are spoken in China. That's a point of pride and unity. It has a lot to do with the fact that the communist government ruled in China. They established Mandarin as their official language, so there's tremendous pressure in order to speak it, whereas in another country next to it, India, with just almost the same population, they've got over 400 languages, remember, that compete against one another because, well, there's not as much government control. And think about this. Language can be a source of unity, right? If everybody speaks the same language, it's going to usually make it easier for the government to maintain unity with the people. Whereas, think about if you have just a few languages spoken, let alone 400, how difficult is that to communicate government interests to the population? Very, very difficult. As you can see, language families around the world. This is a wonderful map, and quite frankly, it's a map that you're going to need to know. Now, not like it's exactly, all right, but you need to know a general idea where the major language families of the world are located, all right? So you're going to need to know these families down here and where they are primarily spoken, all right? So, for instance, some of them are easier for us, right? I mean, obviously, Japanese is spoken in Japan, Korean is spoken in Korea, and really not outside of that area. We've got a lot of, I think Africa is a good example, but I believe some later slides talk about that. The top half is Afro-Asiatic, right, which includes parts of Africa and Asia, as I mentioned to you. And then the southern half is Niger-Congo, right, which are more African kind of tribal languages that are spoken. Okay? Let's go to, we got Altaic in Central Asia, right, like I mentioned to you. We've got Sino-Tibetan here, right? We've got Austro-Asiatic, right, languages of Southeast Asia. I believe I mentioned that. Austronesian, I mentioned, are the island languages of Southeast Asia as well. You'll notice others. These are Native languages, for instance, like Eskimo, Aleut, alrighty. Down here, you've got native languages going on, right? Down here, you've got Aboriginal languages in Australia, so these would be the languages spoken by tribes in that area, the native people. that developed on their own, separate, unique from the rest of the major language families because they didn't have contact with those language families. Again, several other languages families are spoken by large numbers of people in East and Southeast Asia. Isolation on islands and peninsulas contributed to independent development in this region. Javanese is the largest language of the Austronesian family. You can see where Austronesian is spoken. Look at how Madagascar is on there as well. We believe people actually traveled across the Indian Ocean all the way to Madagascar. And so Madagascar is actually linked not with the other African languages. It's linked, interestingly enough, with the languages of Southeast Asia as part of the same family, which means people at some point moved from Southeast Asia over to Madagascar. And they have similar connections between their languages. Isn't that fascinating? Anyways, Austronesian, Southeast Asia, islands, 90 million people speak it. Javanese is the most common. Javanese is spoken on the largest island of Indonesia, which is called Java. Austroasiatic, as you can see here, right? Austroasiatic in Southeast Asia, like I mentioned, Vietnamese is the largest language spoken out of that group. 80 million speakers, kind of dominated in the area by Sino-Tibetan. So going back to that really quickly. So the point there is, Vietnamese speakers, Thai speakers, do not speak from the same family as Sino-Tibetan. They originated from different families, even though they're geographically close to one another. This is called Thai, Kadai. These are also languages in Southeast Asia that are part of the same family. Thai, right? People in Thailand speak it. Separate from the Austronesians, separate from Austroasiatic, separate from Sino-Tibetan. All right, so Vietnamese and Thai speakers speak actually a language that originated from a different family. Okay. Japanese, they call it Japonic or Japanese, about 120 million speakers. As you can see, it's located only in Japan, and that has a lot to do with the isolation of Japan because of its island status. All right. Interestingly enough, Japan also uses a phonetic symbol system. I shouldn't say also. They use a phonetic symbol system. So it's kind of a mixture of phonetics and logograms as well. It's a difficult language, as I understand, to understand because of its interesting mix between the two, between the pictures and the alphabet style. There we go. We can see Japan in action right there. All right, we can see a typical Japanese downtown urban area. You'll see all of that language on display in the area. Okay. Korean or Koreanic, about 80 million people speak it. Obviously, it's located in North and South Korea. Although, from what I understand, those two languages have been so isolated from one another since the 1950s, they've almost developed into their own languages where it's difficult to understand one from the other. Afro-Asiatic is located in Southwest Asia and North Africa. Arabic is by far the largest of those languages. About 500 million people speak it. And as you can see, this is the dominant language in the Middle East and in the northern half of Africa. It has a lot to do with the spread of Islam. Arabic was the official language of Islam. And so therefore, where Islam was strongest, generally speaking, Arabic was, and led to the massive spread of Afro-Asiatic languages across that region. And like I said, it's the official language in 24 countries of the Middle East and North Africa. They do have a alphabet system, all right, that is used. It's the Arabic system. So we're not looking at logograms here. We're actually looking at an alphabet type. Altaic is spread out over a large area, but it's only got 75 million speakers. These are not the world's most populated countries. Turkish is the most common, spoken in Turkey there. And then the countries of Central Asia, for instance, like, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, all of these view it as, all of these speak in Altaic form. But again, not a ton of speakers. Central Asia, kind of widely divergent languages. Again, Turkish is the most common. A lot of the old countries that were part of the Soviet Union, when they broke up, they went back to speaking their native tongues instead of Russian. And so we have a lot of unique languages here that are spoken that we lump together as the Altaics. All right. Again, you'll notice this is Turkish, right? So first thing you're going to notice with their language system and is their alphabet that's very similar to our own in terms of the Latin style of alphabet. All right. African languages. Wow, Africa's a puzzle. It's a mix. There's more than 1,000 that are spoken. Many are spoken by small numbers. They most lack any sort of written tradition, so you must speak it in order to know it. There's no written form of it. A lot of tribal uniqueness. People identify as members of tribes in Africa, ethnic tribes. And so a lot of times individual tribes would have their own language system that they would use that might be very different even from tribes around them as well. So we have 1,000 different distinct languages that we've identified in Africa. We're looking at some of the most common. In the southern half of Africa, the most common by far is Niger-Congo. That is the largest family. And the most commonly spoken version of that family, or language in that family, is Swahili, which is really just a mixture of different tribal tongues. There's over 30 million people that speak it. It's a language that was really developed originally by mixing different languages in the area together so that everybody could communicate a little bit better. So it's not so much its own unique language as it is the language of a bunch of the smaller languages that were blended together so that people could communicate despite the fact that they might have their own unique native tongue. All right. It's a language that's used to speak with outsiders from different villages because the village itself might speak its own smaller tribal language, but Swahili allows them to communicate with others from outside. Nilo-Saharan. So again, please remember, you've got Afro-Asiatic up here, and Arabic is the largest. We've got Niger-Congo down here, right, and Swahili is the largest. And then right in the center, we have what are called Nilo-Saharan or Nilo-Saharan. And that is languages that are spoken in Central Africa. These are oftentimes languages that were spoken by folks that lived in the Saharan region or right underneath it or in the Nile area. The most common is called Lo. It's spoken in Kenya. And these languages are very much being threatened by Arabic. A lot of folks are abandoning their Nilo-Saharan languages, and they are adopting universal languages like Arabic or even English instead. All right. Then Khoisan. Khoisan is a small language group that's spoken in southwestern Africa. Folks, these are the ones that speak a lot of times with clicks or the popping sound. So, all right, that is a good example of it. Again, very much under threat, but Nama is the most common version of this. You'll notice only 233,000 people speak it. So when we're talking about tens of millions in other places, this is a small group, but it's a unique group. These were generally native tribes in the jungle areas that developed their own communication system that was very unique. It's very much being overwhelmed by Niger-Congo languages instead. Again, I think this is a wonderful map that shows you the wide variety that's going on there in Africa. Northern half, Afro-Asiatic, right? Arabic, right? Southern half, it's primarily Niger-Congo, right? Central Africa, we've got Nilo-Saharan, right? You'll see that there's pockets of that still. Then we've got Khoisan down here, right? Anyways, thousands of languages that are spoken, all right? So that's one of the reasons why I think Africa remains so divided, so less united, is because of the wide number of languages that are spoken there, difficult to communicate, to coordinate with one another. All right. Again, got to come back to this because this is arguably our most important thing we got to take away from this. You got to be able to identify the families, like we just did. You got to be able to identify the branches, and then you got to be able to identify groups. Now, we focus primarily on Indo-European because it's the most famous, but you have to be able to describe the differences between these as well. We'll get a ton of practice in class doing this, although admittedly not as much as we would like. The last thing I want to do here is hopefully I have this here. Yes, let's watch this brief video, please. And I think it does a really good job of kind of showing us Indo-European. So we believe language developed in what is to modern day Turkey, and then it spreads out, right, forms different. That's what we would call those families: Balto-Slavic, Indo-Iranian, Albanian, Armenian, Greek. You'll see Germanic right up there. Spreading now into the India area as well. Got some funkadelic music going on here. What's that? Like that beat. Individual groups and families and individual languages are being formed here, right? Interesting, right? Fascinating stuff. Okay. Anyways, I believe, folks, that covers an introduction to a language as we know it. That's where we're going to stop here. Signing out. It's Mr. M. This is our introduction to language. We're going to be spending a great deal more time on this, but this kind of gives you an idea of what you need to know. And some of the highlights there from Chapter 5, Learning Guide 1. All right, make sure you know those families. Make sure you know where they're located. And then we're going to focus, obviously, a lot more on Indo-European, since that one is unique to us, and that's a good example because half of the world speaks it, of how you can divide it then up into branches and groups.